Hi, and welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. This podcast is about the place where design and development overlap. We talk with experts to get their point of view about trends in design, code, and how it relates to the world around us. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. If you want to get in touch with the show, ask some questions, or generally tell us what you think, go ahead and tweet us at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you. Hey everybody, Chris Strahl here with the Design Systems Podcast. Today I'm talking to Kate Halvorsen and Cintia Romero. You all are both from Pinterest. Kate, you're a staff product designer. Cintia, you're a senior product designer. And you both work on the Gestalt design system. Welcome to the program.
We are so happy to be here.
So before the show, we had chatted a little bit about sort of the uniqueness of the Gestalt design system, and that you all have a big task, and that is the creation of a design system for content that isn't yours, that is also global content, that is also broadly very large scale. So talk to me a little bit about all this stuff.
We have been doing a lot of great work on Gestalt, on Pinterest, to make sure that we have the documentation that designers need and engineers need, and why not program managers and product managers can also use and benefit from the system. It has been a lot of work. I don't know if you follow how much the Gestalt documentation has progressed through the years, but each day we have been developing new ways to show our documentation and to support not only the users of the system, but how do we support our pinners as well.
Well, and you bring up a good point. It is public, and so you can go check it out, right? It's gestalt.pinterest.systems, right?
Yes, it's an open source, actually, design system, and everybody can go and take a look and give us feedback, people.
I've had the benefit now of working on 3 different systems. I worked on Atmos at United Airlines. I've worked on Cookbook at Grubhub, and now Gestalt at Pinterest. And Gestalt is definitely kind of the most evolved of the design systems that I've worked on. It's interesting, kind of you start at this very basic level of like, we're just going to build components and focus on that. And then you kind of get to this, okay, we're going to evolve into documentation, and we're going to get really specific about documentation and making sure that we have that nailed down. And then you get to Pinterest where, we have components, we have a good base for documentation. Now we're starting to add levels on that, like animation, and we're building out the mobile library more in depth. And so it's kind of these new layers on top of the base design system, which is fun.
Yeah, I really like how you all have organized this as well, because there's the traditional, like, here's some docs to help you get started with things, and then all the things that you would expect, right? Foundations, where you have a bunch of things around tokens and standards, your component library. But then you have like this really interesting section for team support, where you can actually like talk about advocacy and contribution. And I think that's really interesting too, because there's a lot in here about things like design file hygiene and training. And so you give people a place to get help and to also be good contributors. And then having a roadmap that's public along with a set of release notes that's really well crafted and goes back like forever. You can see how the system evolves and how the work you've done. By the way, I love the release notes being updated in terms of design updates and engineering updates and how you can filter that. That's really fun too. But you can sort of see how things have evolved and how this system has gone from something a couple of years ago to what it is now. And the ability to sort of see the story progress in the actual UI of the place where you're delivering that is so cool.
Cintia's over here cheering because she just wrote those team support docs.
Yeah, not only me, like the whole team helped a lot with that. And it makes me so happy, Chris, to hear that. Because when we think on design systems, we are not just thinking about components and code samples and Figma libraries. We really embrace Gestalt as a community. It's a community for our designers, a community for our engineers and everybody else, cross-functional partners and external folks too. We want our design systems to be really a source of truth, not only for Pinterest, but we want it to help folks beyond Pinterest. And the team support page, the goal for this is how we support our users. How do they understand how to create files, like the file hygiene? Is there any way that we can help them to do things right and to benefit from Gestalt? And there are a lot of thinking on community level. How do we improve things for everyone that goes to Gestalt? And it makes me so happy to hear. I was cheering when you were talking like, yes, woohoo, you're doing that great. But yeah, thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, Chris, you said before on the podcast that like, design systems are about the people who build them. And I think something that's really important, especially to Cintia and I, is creating this kind of like environment of education that the designers, if they have any questions, not only can they reach out to us on like Slack or email, but they can also sign up for kind of these training sessions where we teach them how to use Gestalt, how to pull components into their files, and then especially like our accessibility trainings where we discuss, how to kind of be a better designer as far as accessibility.
I love the whole way that it's organized. I also love that you all have a lot of links in here that take you other places. I think one of the great things for design systems, when you talk about it being a place where everybody can leave it better than they found it, that includes the ability to make it a gathering place for other external resources. And so there's a lot of stuff in the system I can't click on and actually see where it goes. Like I definitely clicked request a component, and that seems like a link that takes you to some sort of internal system. But I love that idea that you're trying to aggregate all the actions related to the design system all in one place. The other part of this that is interesting is you all serve such a huge variety of people all across the planet. And so when you think about that, it's hard to talk about something with that much reach and that much sort of expansiveness without thinking about the ideas of accessibility and inclusivity. And I know this is a passion topic for both of you. And so I'm here to kind of just wind you up and let you go on this. The ideas that you've baked into the design system related to accessibility, I think are really interesting. And in particular, Cintia, you had a couple of things that you wanted to talk about here.
Yes. If you see Pinterest today, when you think about global users, I believe today we have about 463 million of active users on Pinterest, and this is a lot. Like, whoa, it's a lot. And we have 1 billion people worldwide. And how do you make sure when we say Pinterest missions, it's to bring everyone the inspiration to create the life that they love? When you say the word everyone, are we really thinking about everyone? How do we make sure that we include every single user, that we can create experience that can be used for the most amount of users that we can provide the same experience? We think a lot on accessibility, not only accessibility, but also inclusive design, retreating our users right. One example, when you think on design systems and you think on form fields, you have like an input to write your name and last name. For example, myself, I am from Brazil. I have a huge last name. When I go to fill certain form fields and I try to add my last name, it says, oh, it's not a valid last name. You need like a shorter word for your last name. I'm like, whoa, but this is my last name. How am I gonna like subscribe for this? And I need to change my last name. So I'm able to do like a sign up or something. And on Pinterest, we try to evaluate those things on Gestalt. Okay, how do we treat inclusivity, like people from different countries, different areas, different cultural background? How do we deal with localization? How things they get translated in different language that has more like characters? And a lot of our work on Gestalt is to make sure that we are really caring about everyone and thinking about every user case that we can. We know there are still a lot of things to do. We are like far away from perfect, but it's one of our goals. Not only me and Kate, we are like here represent Gestalt today, but the entire team on Gestalt, from our manager PJ, who is amazing, to everybody else, everyone, even our apprentice designer, it's focused on accessibility. So this is one of our top goals for Gestalt.
Yeah, so Kate, what are some of the ways that this is made manifest in the actual system itself? Like what's different about the design system because you've thought about accessibility than maybe if you hadn't?
I think about like, again, going back to previous systems I've worked on, I think the biggest contrast is just, and this is like very ethereal and not like grounded in anything, but just this feeling of like empathy in the product that when you're using Pinterest, to some degree, I feel like you can feel that Pinterest cares about how you utilize the product in, kind of previous lives. I run into, using a screen reader or something like that, I'll run into an issue and bring it up to a team member or report a bug or something. A big bummer is when you get the response like, we don't have time to fix that, or that's not a high priority. Whereas at Pinterest, it is. You say like, hey, my indicator got trapped when using a screen reader, and everybody's like, oh no, like that sucks. Like we got to get that fixed, And I think that translates into the product itself. You feel that like it was made to work for you, which is wonderful. And obviously we're not perfect.
Well, of course, nobody is, right? But what are some of the ways that you do take that time to build that empathy? Because, you all flagging something that some other team or some other organization might have found inconsequential, and the design and engineering side of Pinterest being like, all right, well, saddle up, we're going to go fix this thing. What creates that difference in culture? Because I think that's what you're talking about, is a valuing of inclusivity and accessibility as a part of your culture.
I think this was Cintia's brainchild, but we do accessibility training for incoming designers or designers that haven't had it yet. And I think we're going to try and do it maybe yearly or something to that degree. But part of that training is that I teach our designers how to use a screen reader. And I am very passionate about that because that was one of the things that totally like shifted my perspective. I remember I was in kind of this learning session with Derek Featherstone, who's a really wonderful leader in accessibility. And he, showed how inaccessible our experience was at a previous company. And I remember feeling so embarrassed and so frustrated, but also like very empowered that like, hey, I'm the person that can fix that. Like, I know how to fix that. And I go into teaching how to use a screen reader with the same hope that designers will feel that feeling that I felt like, oh no, this really sucks. And it is creating a disability for me, but I'm also the person that can go and like fix it and make it not work just better for somebody that perhaps has low vision or something to that effect, but also for everybody that comes and uses the experience. So I think it's things like that, like just kind of owning up to where we're not perfect and taking on the responsibility to fix it.
That's awesome. I love that philosophically. It's funny that you mentioned screen readers. I remember not all that long ago. I mean, look, Knapsack is the first design company I've ever really like owned, right? And so I remember when I was first getting started, I had the impression, like a lot of people do, about like, how the headline tags are just bigger, bolder text. And then realizing that like, oh, people with screen readers, those are organizational units for how they actually like traverse a web page. And that blew my mind.
Yeah, the headline's just screaming at you.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, oh, there's so much more to this than I ever realized. And I remember my first like exploration into that and being so interested in this entire like different world and point of view of how people that weren't like me in their ability to read a web page traverse the internet. Cintia, what about you? What was your sort of experience with this about building empathy?
I think Kate explained that pretty well. When I joined Pinterest, I was chatting with designers. I was participating on design creates, and I mentioned, oh, hey, this is not accessible. And people, oh, but it is resizing. They were like kind of relating accessibility with responsive design, not really understanding what accessibility was. On the engineering side, people, they had more ideas, but not too much on the design side. And they decided, okay, let's create an accessibility training so we can show people what accessibility is and build this empathy. And also share our personal histories. Like, I'm colorblind as well, and certain colors I can't distinguish them by just relying on colors. And like, hey, do you know that some people are colorblind? They can't see, oh, but almost nobody is like, yes. We have a lot of people who don't know because some disabilities, they are invisible. You can't tell if a person has a disability or not all the time. And we were trying to show that. And Kate, the part that she does on the training on the screen reader, it's pretty interesting because we show our defects. We show Pinterest product. We're not like showing any other website. We're asking designers to go through Pinterest, try to access Pinterest through the keyboard, try to use the screen reader. How do you feel about that? Do you get stuck in some of the experience? And how does it feel for you? Another thing, like long time ago, we have communities at Pinterest, we have Pinable and the Accessibility Work Group as well, that they do a lot of initiatives to increase accessibility at Pinterest. And one time we had one speaker coming up to speak for Pinterest about accessibility. He has disability, he's blind, and he was trying to fill the form to submit to Pinterest. And he couldn't fill the form in our platform. And we're like, oh, this is so bad. How can we improve that? And by showing that to our leaders, like, hey, this is not good. We need to do better. We can't exclude people. We want everyone to use Pinterest. And we decided to show like what is happening, why people are not accessing the products, why we need to do better. And by showing the struggles, by showing the defects that we have on Pinterest product, we can create this empathy and motivate people to do better. And today, Katie and I were talking, oh, this is so cool because we trained so many designers. If we count the amount of designers and engineers that we trained last year, it was over 600. And it was so positive. It was so positive. Like we got such awesome feedback. People, they had no idea about screen readers. When Kate was teaching, they were like, wow, this is like so interesting. I didn't know that this exists, that I could use that. I'm going to start using screen readers to test my design. And I'm like, yes.
There's a lot of initial panic, which is kind of funny to watch too. It's like, oh no, my phone's talking at me so fast. But it's fun to see people like figure it out and find issues. I think another part of the accessibility work is like learning from folks who are struggling with those abilities, like being able to access things. One of my first design system jobs, we actually had an accessibility designer, and I think we're trying to figure that out at Pinterest as well. Her name was Melly Manick, and she was like so wonderful. She encouraged me to take ASL classes so we could like goof around at work and talk to each other. Nobody would know what we were saying. But one of the things I loved about her is she at times made me feel like very uncomfortable and out of my depth. And I think that helped me grow so much as an accessibility advocate, because she would point out and she'd be like, we need captions on this. I can't hear it, you know, and things that I would not even really think about. So learning from the 1 billion folks too, you're bound to have some at your company that this is a very real like situation, you know, this is how they access content.
Yeah, I love the idea of how multifaceted this is as a part of culture. And what you said about intentionally being a little uncomfortable. I think that one of the things about joining any company is you're already a little uncomfortable when you're joining a new culture and a new group of people and trying to figure out your place in that. And the idea of using your own product and intentionally creating that discomfort around where it doesn't work like you'd like it to, or maybe like you even expected it to, I think that's really cool. And I think that also being able to build relationships and have people on your team that are like, you know, colorblind designers, that are people that actually have this need, that can empathize with users and customers. That's really cool. It's funny because you always like want to ask the questions as an interviewer, like, how do you create culture? But there's no real simple answer to that. You can't be like, oh yeah, you know, we had a VP like hand down a document and everybody had to sign it. And all of a sudden our culture is different, right? Like that's not the way it works. But the idea that you have this very participatory process in learning about this need inside of your organization, I think that's what kind of creates it. And it sounds to me like it's really changed the way you all work.
Yeah, and it's not only, if you think on accessibility, create accessible experience, it benefits everybody. It's not only folks with disabilities. For example, I bet you at certain moment of your life, you turned on captions while you're like watching a Netflix movie because it helped you to concentrate more. Maybe it was noisy and you couldn't focus. I do that all the time. I'm also an immigrant. And when I moved to the US, I didn't speak English at all. And I wanted to watch movies and see things here in the US. I used captions all the time to learn English. It was created for people that they have some deaf disability or maybe they are hard of hearing, but it benefits actually everybody. If you think on Pinterest, we had a data recently that most of our pinners, we say pinners, our users, most of our pinners, they turn off the audio when they're consuming our videos. I'm like, whoa, we really need captions because I believe today we only have captions on Android. And we are like trying to expand that to all the areas so we can make it real for everybody. And it benefits really everyone and not only captions. If you think on color, like dark mode, it benefits people who have vision issues, but it also benefits people. I prefer that because it's a preference thing and maybe the brightness, it's not too good to me. There are a lot of benefits in so many things that you can do to improve the experience.
Yeah, I have a funny video captioning story. So I have two young children. I talk about them from time to time on the podcast, but I never understood why people watched video with the sound off all the time until I had kids. And once you get those kids to bed, like you can't make a peep for like an hour. And so I figured out like, oh, okay, I need to figure out how to watch videos with captions so that I can still like consume content on the internet because I'm not sitting there doing anything because I can't make any noise, but I also can't have the video make any noise. And I actually had to show my parents how to do this because my parents, they're older and videos need to be really loud for them to hear it. And they would play like YouTube videos at deafening volume in the living room while I was trying to put the kids to bed. And I was like, here, let me show you how you can like not have that be a thing. And now like their house is a much quieter, lovelier place to hang out in because I'm not listening to YouTube videos all the time at full volume. But just as like a silly anecdote, I mean, like that stuff is wonderful because it does have an impact on folks' lives. We switched away from Zoom as a company to use a different conference meeting platform because it had live transcription. So it's funny. I was looking at Zencastr, which is the platform we use to record this podcast, to see if there was a transcript system. Because Cintia, you mentioned this was your first podcast in English, and I'm sorry, there's not. By the way, if anybody from Zencastr is listening to this, like that would be a cool feature. So you can't really talk about accessibility without talking about inclusive design, but there is some nuance in the difference between them. And so I wanted to open up that can of worms next and maybe start with what do you all view as the difference between those concepts?
I think inclusive design, when you think inclusivity, we're really thinking everyone, different cultures, different background, different language and gender. There are so many specs included on that, including accessibility too, as part of inclusive design. When you talk about accessibility, we are talking about folks with disabilities, not only permanent disabilities, but also temporary, situational, all the types of disabilities that you can think of, also mental struggles. There are so many things that we don't see in visible disabilities. It all goes into accessibility and inclusive design. We're thinking in a broader audience, also including accessibility, but also think on these different cultural backgrounds, especially because we're a global company. So how do we treat folks from different countries, from different areas? And they have different religions, different gender, or different information. Yeah, that is how I see that.
That makes me think of I'm at the very beginning stages of working with folks to develop like an illustration library at Pinterest, which is very exciting. But we were thinking about localization. And one thing that I learned is that the check mark is not always, doesn't mean like done, like good. I think it's like the Nordic countries. I might be wrong about this, but like Finland, Sweden, it actually kind of means the opposite of like good or done. And so having to like think about that too and the context of folks viewing these experiences and how they will feel about them. Like, are they going to see this illustration and be like, oh, I messed something up because it has a check mark on it, instead of the opposite. So I think to some degree, like that is inclusive design. And then I think inclusive design also encapsulates accessibility. It's a part of inclusive design.
I remember my first brush with this being when I was in Africa, actually doing a website for the US military. And so in that, what we had to think about was internet penetration. If you're, in a major city in Africa, At the time, you probably had cell phone service. You maybe even had an iPhone, and it worked in, a similar way to how it worked in the US. But the moment you were outside a major city, it was like questionable whether you'd have cell phone service at all. And in fact, many people carried multiple cell phones to be able to make sure that they could have internet access as they jumped from network to network to network across the country. And the idea of like what you do to design for that problem space was this really eye-opening moment for me about, how you think about your own bias as a designer or an engineer. Like, I just assume that people have internet access, right? Like, I assume that people have a cell phone. Cell phone penetration in the United States is very tremendous, and networks here are reliable and bandwidth is fast. But it's not that way across the world. And to try to think about like what that looks like, I just sort of put myself in a position about like, look, if I was in the mountains of Idaho and I wasn't sure the next time I was going to get cell phone signal, like, how am I designing for that app? And that was a real opening moment for me for the difference between what accessible design is versus inclusive design. Just thinking about how people actually go about accessing the internet and the difference there.
Yeah, this is a very good example. And even if you think on voice interface, I remember when I moved here, I never had Alexa or Google Home in Brazil because it was very expensive. I didn't have money to buy that. And I got here, oh, this is so cool. I wanted to get this. And I was speaking, giving comments, and I still have my accent, my Brazilian accent, but it was way higher and way stronger. And I was saying like, hey, Alexa, play the song blah, blah, blah. And it was all the songs, but not the song that I asked for because of my accent. I'm like, I hate this thing. It does not work. It doesn't understand me. I don't want to set up this to speak in Portuguese because I'm learning English. And I think, okay, how are you like treating different cultural background if people they have accent? How do we also use our terminology? For example, on design systems, we write a lot of documentation. And sometimes I'm reviewing some copy and my manager like, hey, Cintia, can you help me to review this page? I'm like, hey, can you change that sentence? I think it's a very cool way that you said that, but this is a very, very specific slang from here. I don't know if people from different cultures, like I didn't know that. I needed to search what this means. Could you change that word instead so we make it more inclusive and people they feel that they belong on this documentation? You're not being too specific. There are a bunch of things that we can do to make people feel that they belong on that documentation, that they understand what we are creating. They go through our product and they feel, oh, I'm home. Because home is where you feel that you belong. It's not like your physical place. So you can feel that you're home when you're navigating through Pinterest, if you feel welcome, if you have a great experience. But you can feel the opposite if you don't understand the language, if you don't understand the illustrations, as Kate mentioned. There are a bunch of things that we can do to make experience more inclusive, not only accessible, but both. So we need to think really in both.
It's awesome. It's funny you mentioned the voice side of things, right? Because my 5-year-old also loves to play with our Google Home. We actually switched over from Alexa to Google Home, and he called Google Home Alexa for like 6 months. But what he'll do is he'll actually change his speech patterns when he's trying to get Google to play The Ants Go Marching or Baby Shark or something like that. And so it's really funny because he's like, yeah, I have to speak like a grown-up to get Google to understand me. And I thought that was a really adorable thing that he said, was he was like, yeah, I have to speak like a grown-up. It's hard. And he literally changes his intonation. He'll be like, hey, Google, play Ants Go Marching. And it works. And he's able to figure it out. But like through a substantial amount of trial and error and many, many times shouting across the kitchen at a smart speaker. But I thought that was a funny explanation because I definitely see that, like, not because of different languages, but because, my 5-year-old's still learning how to speak. And so it's interesting to see how that reflects.
I think that's an interesting, like, tie-in too of what Cintia mentioned earlier about how any accessibility improvements you make helps everybody. So, if we make language kind of more simple, more clear, that helps Cintia, who is not a native English speaker that helps your 5-year-old talk to Alexa that helps me who struggles with ADHD and kind of like understanding like long strings of content. And it just like, it shows you the different levels of like how accessible design really helps everybody, you know?
Completely. So I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about AI in this field a little bit. And so thinking about, this wonderful world of AI, I just got back from a conference in San Francisco where I spent a bunch of time talking about AI with a bunch of people that work at Google. Thinking about like the future that is AI enabled, one of the things that I'm very hopeful about with AI technology is that it does give us this opportunity to present more accessible, more inclusive experiences. And not in the sense of like, obviously there are drawbacks here, right? Like the people that write the algorithms, those algorithms get written for them, those algorithms carry innate biases, etc. So I'm not trying to discount a lot of the problematic side of AI that is still emerging, but there are a lot of things that we can do with AI now that were hard to do before that help us with the creation of more accessible experiences. And Kate, you had a really interesting one before the show that I'd love if you shared that.
So yeah, Pinterest has a version of a hackathon that we call Makeathon. And just this week, actually, some engineers had a really great idea that they reached out to me about kind of doing the design side of things for using AI to auto generate captions and alt text. And so what they're doing is they're taking all of these kind of images and inputting them into the AI and seeing, how it kind of generates the alt text for these images. And then we're going to work to try and figure out if that makes sense, if it's clear, if it's understandable, if that's how we would, describe those images ourselves, and try and kind of refine the AI to just be better at that overall. And then, present that as a hackathon project, which I think is really fun and a really cool way to tie in AI and accessibility.
Yeah, for certain. And if anything, you all deal with a lot of images. So
Yeah.
that's probably going to have fairly high consequence work.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's going to be huge.
Yeah, we do have today the ability to add alt text on the pins, but a lot of users, they don't do that. They don't want to spend the time to go and add the alt text. So this could definitely help if we can avoid bias.
Yeah, there's also interesting things around using AI to detect text and kind of pull that out so that low vision users or blind users can read what's in like the image of a pin, which is not really possible today, which is also very exciting.
Yeah, there's a lot of these things that seem like a really interesting way of experiencing content in ways that we haven't before. And whether that's automatic tagging or text generation or the ability to parse things in new and interesting ways. One of the things that we're actually working on with the podcast right now that we have this proof of concept out about is the ability to take all of our podcast audio for the Design Systems podcast and be able to ask a question of one of the guests or me, the host, and have it search through the repository of, at this point, like several hundred hours of podcast content and have it actually answer you in my voice or in the guest's voice. And that always blows me away. Like it actually trips me out. We had one of our engineers make a sound clip using my voice the other day based on some of the podcast audio. And it is uncanny. But it's an interesting way of thinking about, like, if I tell somebody that's a new employee of Knapsack or somebody that's interested in design systems, yeah, go listen to like 60 plus episodes of the Design Systems podcast. They're going to be like, you're crazy. But if they have a specific question that they're interested in, the ability to say like, hey, what would, Kate and Cintia think about accessibility, and have it actually be able to respond conversationally in a 30-second clip of the both of you, I think that'd be really cool.
It's both wonderful and so creepy.
Yeah, but actually, this would be awesome. We have today, I think all the companies, they do have like a Slack channel for answering design systems questions. And we have new designers all the time, and they ask the same question that we answered 2 months ago, but it is still the same answer. We tried bots, it's like bots, to point to the chat, but it quite doesn't work that well. So if you could have AI creating this personalized experience, if people, they ask something, not only answer the question, but point to the right file, to the right library, because we have different libraries. We have iOS, Android, and web. How do we point different teams to different components and needs? And how do we use AI to create automation, like for our tools inside the design system? Maybe it's a plugin, we don't know. But we do have some folks, managers and directors, they have been talking a lot about opportunities for us. How can we leverage from AI to create more personalized experience for our users? We have a lot of different folks, and we have new folks all the time coming to the design systems. We often have people confusing brand with design system. This could be some very valuable way to direct folks to the right channels.
Yeah, and you mentioned personalization, which is something I'm really excited about. The idea in particular of a company like Pinterest where you're all about highlighting other content that isn't necessarily your content. Like how do people want to view that content? Like do they have particularly good eyesight and so they like lots of small tiles? Do they have a need for like more dense information or more text-based content instead of image-based content? Like the ability to surface and discover different things in a system based upon a user preference and to be able to personalize with AI sounds really interesting also.
Yeah, I love that. And we do have today people, they can search hair products by hair type, which is awesome. You can search makeup by the color of your skin. There are a bunch of things that we do today trying to personalize the experience for our pinners. And with AI, we could go way beyond and make it much better, include accessibility as part of that.
Yeah, we've also been talking about AI in terms of writing documentation because that's a huge part of Cintia and my everyday is writing just pages and pages and pages of documentation. So is the life of a systems designer. But we've been talking on our team a little bit about training AI on like how we specifically as the Gestalt team write documentation and seeing if we can get an output that is similar to how Cintia would write a page about buttons and hopefully automating something similar like that in the future, which would be a huge help.
Yeah, so writes in the same style as you and it sounds like you, etc. That'd be really interesting. We're experimenting with all this stuff inside of Knapsack right now where you can do two things. You can discover more content about your design system because all these design systems are like fairly large knowledge management problems. If you think about a design system, it's like a novel length work or maybe even multiple novels and trying to understand like, you don't ever say like turn to page 323 of your design system. You usually have like a very specific question about how to use it. And so the AI being able to tell you like how to actually use the design system in an interesting way and to discover that information is really powerful, I think.
Yeah, and the nuances.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like it's why you want to make sure you put your like your voice and tone guidelines and your vision and purpose for the design system inside of your documentation because it's all context, frankly, for robots to help provide you better answers. I also think about the idea, like you said, about content generation. One of the things that's always hard when you're creating a new pattern inside of something like Knapsack is like, what do I create in terms of that initial docs page? And the ability for it to understand like how you've created other docs pages, reference the code or design file that you're attaching to that portion of your system, and have it automatically suggest or generate some content for you. So it's not just a blank page. That's so powerful as a starting point for all these things.
Design system work takes a lot of research. It's a lot of going and looking, what's the best practice from Nielsen Norman? What are these engineers over in this forum talking about as far as like how you should animate a button? What's going on over here? How's this system handling it? And to be able to kind of have an aggregate for all of that information and that I don't have to spend an hour or so of my time going and looking at all of these resources would be a huge jumping off point too, that I can, that is if you can trust your AI that it's not
not
pulling
making shit
false
up.
information and lying to you. Yeah.
I love the idea of aggregating the meta though. So, there is all this meta work attached to the design system. It's not actually like the creation of the content for you, but it's background that you need to be able to actually create that content. The idea of like, how do you aggregate the meta? That's a cool idea.
Yeah, and one thing we could also benefit from this generation of content, not only on the design systems, but for the creators. If you're a creator on Pinterest, you can create pins and showcase your work and try to get followers and inspire other folks. And you don't have, okay, what I'm going to write on this pin. And you could benefit from content generation to help you create content to upload on Pinterest. So there are a lot of opportunities on the UI, not only on the design system side, but on the product. How do we help pinners, especially considering like some folks, they have mobility issues. They can't write too much because they could feel pain or they have a certain type of disability. If you could have a tool to help you to upload content to Pinterest, it would be amazing.
So this has been such an awesome conversation. Thank you both so much for coming on the program and talking about this. If there's anything you could leave our listeners with to kind of say, like, what do you need to remember? What do you need to know about this stuff to make sure that you bring this practice to your organization? What would that be?
I think the biggest thing is continued education, especially if you're interested in accessibility. Get your hands dirty with screen readers and feel uncomfortable using a screen reader because that's what helps you grow. But also, I know Cintia and I have taken the initiative on our own, whether we have educational funding or not, to take accessibility courses and get certification. We both want to take like an international certification this year, which is going to be really fun to do together. But always keep growing. Look to folks who are affected by inaccessibility, people who don't have the same access to these products, and ask them questions and learn from them. And Cintia, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think you said pretty well. Try to find who you should follow, maybe on LinkedIn, go and do networking, meet people who are also passionate about accessibility. We can learn a lot from each other. Talk to people who have disabilities. You're going to learn things that you don't know. We always learn new things every day. And go to Gestalt. I'm going to do a little promotion of our design systems here because we created a very cool page under foundations that we talk about accessibility. We share some checklists for designers and engineers. What are the considerations that you need to have in mind when you're creating design? We have inclusive design links for you. There are a bunch of things there so you can benefit from it.
And we're an open source system.
Yeah.
So get in there, check it out.
Contribute.
Send us questions on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for being on. I really appreciate it. This has been the Design System Podcast. I'm Chris Strahl. Have a great day, everybody. That's all for today. This has been another episode of the Design Systems Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or a topic you'd like to know more about, find us on Twitter at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you with show ideas, recommendations, questions, or comments. As always, this pod is brought to you by Knapsack. You can check us out at knapsack.cloud. Have a great day.